Maria didn't grow up with much. She lived in a tiny apartment on the edge of town, where the walls were cracked and the heat barely worked in the winter. Some nights, when the wind blew hard, it felt like the whole building would fall apart. But Maria never complained. She was used to hard things. At 22 years old, Maria worked 2 jobs just to stay afloat. In the mornings, she served coffee at a little diner. In the evenings, she cleaned offices after everyone else had gone home. She barely made enough money to pay rent and buy groceries. Sometimes she skipped dinner so she could afford her bus fare to work. Still, Maria kept going. She had dreams bigger than the broken sidewalks and old streetlights of her neighborhood. She dreamed of being someone who made a difference. She had always loved books, especially ones about justice and righting wrongs. As a little girl, she would sit by the library window, reading about brave lawyers who fought for people who had no voice. People often said Maria was too quiet or too soft to ever make it. They laughed when she said she wanted to help others, but Maria didn't mind. She believed strength didn't always have to be loud. Life was tough, but inside Maria's heart, there was a fire. It was small, but it never went out. And even though nobody knew it, Maria was carrying a secret that would soon change everything. Not just for her, but for everyone who had ever doubted her. One cold morning, everything started to fall apart. Maria had just come home from a long night of cleaning offices. Her feet hurt, and all she wanted was to sleep. But taped to her apartment door was a bright red notice. She pulled it off and read the words slowly, her hands shaking. Eviction notice. The landlord, Mr. Denton, was accusing her of damaging the apartment and disturbing her neighbors. None of it was true. Maria was careful. She barely made any noise at all, and she cleaned her tiny place so often that it smelled like lemon soap most days. But now he was kicking her out. Maria's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't lose her home. It was old and broken, but it was the only place she had. She grabbed her coat and rushed down to the rental office to talk to Mr. Denton. He didn't even let her speak. "You're a troublemaker," he said, laughing in her face. "Take it up in court if you want. See how far you get." Court? Maria had never been to court in her life. Lawyers cost money she didn't have. People in her neighborhood said you didn't stand a chance unless you had a fancy lawyer with a shiny suit. Maria had no one. She felt the panic rise up inside her, thick and heavy like a storm cloud. A few days later, she received a court summons. She was supposed to show up in front of a judge in 2 weeks. If she lost, she would have nowhere to go. Friends at the diner told her not to waste her time. Landlords always win, they said, especially against girls like us. Maria nodded, but stayed quiet. She didn't tell anyone about the long nights she had spent studying. She didn't say a word about the dusty certificate hidden under her bed. Instead, she went home, sat at her small kitchen table, and read the court papers over and over. Fear clawed at her, but something stronger burned inside her too. She wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The day of the hearing came faster than Maria expected. She stood in front of the mirror that morning, trying to make her old clothes look nice. Her best outfit was a faded blue skirt and a sweater with a tiny hole near the sleeve. She brushed her hair carefully and tied it back, wishing she looked stronger, richer, more important. But she didn't. When she walked into the courthouse, her stomach twisted. The building smelled like dust and cold air. Everything felt too big, too shiny. People in suits hurried past her without even looking. She clutched her worn backpack against her chest and found the right courtroom. Inside, Mr. Denton was already there, laughing with his lawyer. His lawyer wore a slick black suit and shiny shoes. When he saw Maria, he smirked and whispered something to Mr. Denton. They both laughed. Maria's cheeks burned with shame. She sat down alone at the defendant's table. Her hands shook so badly that the papers in front of her rattled. Every time she looked up, it felt like all eyes were on her, judging her. The judge entered the room. He was an older man with glasses perched low on his nose. When he looked at Maria, he sighed a little, like he had already made up his mind. The lawyer stood up and started speaking fast, throwing out big words that Maria didn't understand right away. He said she was disruptive, careless, and a threat to other tenants. None of it was true. but sitting there in her old sweater and scuffed shoes, Maria felt like a criminal anyway. She tried to speak once, but the lawyer cut her off. Your Honor, this girl clearly doesn't have the knowledge to defend herself properly. The courtroom filled with quiet laughter. It was small and mean, but Maria heard it. It stabbed at her heart like tiny knives. The judge turned to her. Miss Alvarez, do you have any representation today? Maria swallowed hard. Her voice was small. No, Your Honor, she said. The judge shook his head slightly like he felt sorry for her, like the whole thing was already over. Maria stared down at the papers on the table. Fear squeezed her chest. She thought about giving up, walking out, letting them win. But then she remembered the nights she spent studying while the world slept. She remembered the promise she made to herself, to never let anyone make her feel less than she was. Slowly, Maria reached into her backpack. It was time. Maria's hands were still shaking, but she knew what she had to do. She reached deep into her backpack and pulled out a thick folder. It was old and a little worn at the edges, but inside it was something powerful, something no one in that room expected. Slowly, carefully, Maria placed a piece of paper on the table in front of the judge. Her heart pounded so loudly she thought everyone could hear it. She looked up, meeting the judge's surprised eyes. I have a law degree, Your Honor, she said, her voice steady now. The courtroom went silent. Mr. Denton's lawyer stopped smiling. People leaned forward in their seats. It felt like the whole world had paused to listen. The judge frowned and picked up the paper. He studied it closely, adjusting his glasses. This is a real degree, he said slowly, from a certified online university, graduated with honors. Maria nodded once. The judge looked at her differently now, not with pity, not with annoyance, but with real interest. Mr. Denton jumped to his feet. This is ridiculous, he shouted. She's lying. Maria didn't even blink. Calmly, she pulled out more papers, transcripts, certificates, study record. She had spent years working overnight shifts and using every spare moment to learn the law. She had taken the classes on an old laptop she bought for $5. She had studied at kitchen tables, library floors, and diner booths during lunch breaks. Nobody had seen her working. Nobody had believed she could do it, but she had. Maria's voice grew stronger as she spoke. I understand my rights, she said, and I know the laws about tenant protection. I am ready to represent myself today. The judge nodded, impressed. He turned to Mr. Denton's lawyer. We'll hear her arguments, he said firmly. For the first time that day, Maria felt taller. She wasn't just a scared girl in old clothes anymore. She was someone who knew what she was doing, someone who deserved to be heard. Around the courtroom, whispers grew louder. Some people smiled, others looked shocked. Mr. Denton's lawyer sat down slowly, his face pale. Maria took a deep breath. The fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time it felt fair, and she was ready. Maria stood up straighter behind the table, papers neatly stacked in front of her. Her hands still trembled a little, but her voice was clear and steady when she spoke. Your Honor, she began, the landlord's eviction notice is illegal. According to state law, tenants must be given proper warning and a chance to fix any problems before eviction. She held up the letter Mr. Denton had taped to her door. This notice gave me no warning, no chance to respond, and the reasons listed are false. I have statements from neighbors who say they never complained about me. Maria reached into her folder and handed the judge a stack of letters, each one signed. Some of the neighbors she barely knew had agreed to help after she explained what was happening. They had seen too many good people pushed out of their homes. The judge flipped through the pages, nodding slowly. Mr. Denton's lawyer tried to interrupt. Your Honor, this is just emotional noise. Maria didn't back down. She looked straight at the lawyer and said, it's evidence. The courtroom stirred again. Some people smiled. Maria could feel the energy shift, like the tide was finally turning her way. She continued speaking, naming real laws, quoting real rules she had spent years memorizing. She pointed out mistakes the landlord had made, not just small mistakes but big ones that could get him in serious trouble. The judge asked her a few tough questions. Maria answered every single one without blinking. Every word she spoke was a brick in a wall she was building to protect herself. By the time she finished, the judge leaned back in his chair looking thoughtful. Mr. Denton and his lawyer looked furious and nervous. The judge sighed and looked at Mr. Denton's lawyer. "Do you have any proof against these claims?" The lawyer shuffled his papers, searching, but his hands were empty. He had come in expecting an easy win. He hadn't prepared for a real fight. Maria stood there, breathing hard but proud. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't helpless. She was fighting back and she was winning. The courtroom was quiet. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to hear what the judge would say. Maria stood tall, her hands folded calmly on the table. She had said everything she needed to say. Now it was in the judge's hands. The judge cleared his throat and looked over his glasses at Mr. Denton. "Mr. Denton," he said firmly, "you have failed to provide any real evidence for eviction. In fact, it seems clear you acted out of unfairness, and possibly even broke tenant laws." Mr. Denton's face turned red, but he said nothing. The judge turned to Maria. "Miss Alvarez, you have defended yourself with great skill and knowledge. You clearly understand your right." Maria felt her heart beating so loudly, she thought it might break out of her chest. "I am dismissing the eviction case immediately," the judge said, banging his gavel once. "Furthermore, Mr. Denton, you are ordered to pay a fine for wrongful eviction practices and harassment." Gasps filled the room. Maria covered her mouth with her hand, hardly able to believe it. She had won. People in the courtroom smiled and nodded at her. A few even clapped quietly before the bailiff asked them to stop. Even the judge gave her a small smile before moving on to the next case. As Maria gathered her papers, a woman in a navy blue suit came up to her. She introduced herself as a lawyer from a respected firm. "We could use someone like you," she said warmly. "Have you ever thought about working in a real law office?" Maria blinked back tears. She had dreamed of this moment, but never really believed it would come true. "I'd love to," she said, her voice shaking with happiness. Mr. Denton and his lawyer stormed out of the courtroom, but Maria didn't care. She wasn't afraid of them anymore. She had fought for herself, she had won, and now she was just getting started. Weeks later, Maria stood outside a small building in her old neighborhood. A handmade sign hung above the door. "Maria Alvarez, legal help for everyone." The place wasn't fancy. The walls were still a little cracked, and the paint was peeling in spots. But to Maria it was beautiful. It was hers. Inside there were a few old desks and chairs she had collected from neighbors who wanted to help. On the walls she hung posters about tenant rights, workers' rights, and free advice clinics. Word had spread fast. People came every day. Single mothers, old men with heavy hands, teenagers scared of losing their homes. Maria sat with each one, listening carefully. She helped them fill out papers, explained their rights, and even represented some in small hearings. She never charged a penny. Maria remembered how it had felt to be alone and scared, to think no one would stand up for her. She had promised herself she would never let anyone else feel that way, if she could help it. Sometimes she still wore that old blue skirt to remind herself where she came from, to remind herself of the battles she had fought, but now she also wore a small silver pin on her jacket, a gift from her new law friends that read, "Power in Kindness." Maria smiled as she locked up her office one evening, the sun setting in gold and purple streaks across the sky. She had come from nothing. She had been laughed at, pushed down, almost beaten, but she never gave up. And now she was a hero, not because she shouted the loudest, but because she stayed standing when it mattered most. The little girl who once sat by the library window dreaming of justice had finally found her place in the world, and she wasn't done yet.